Hello, everyone. Welcome to Moviehouse Mystics. I'm Koda.
And I'm Kevin Gainey.
So, Kevin, we got to address the elephant in the room here, or maybe the donkey in the room. There's an election, and when this video comes out, the election will have happened. So we're not going to get into anything really controversial or anything like that. We quite frankly don't know what's going to happen in the next few days. So
Can we at least talk about things that were not controversial in this election? Like maybe
like
we can talk about previous elections.
Previous election? Oh, yeah, I don't see why not.
Okay, so let's start talking about QAnon. So don't you know that Tom Hanks and his posse of...
Kevin. Oh, my God. The number of philosophical razors that can, if there's a simple explanation, that's probably what it is.
Oh, wow. That's why snake oil salesmen have always survived.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we're talking in today's episode about the Middle Ages, and sometimes it feels like people are still living in them. So today we're getting into a fun little movie called Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Kevin, this was your recommendation. A good one.
Yeah, it was. So I grew up on Monty Python, so I figured that we might as well do an episode devoted to them, and since this is a cult classic, and this is your first time watching it, so I just want to get your impression first.
It's British comedy, which is its own kind of subgenre of comedy.
Most of the subgenre is just the accent, because you could be saying anything, and as long as you make it some kind of Cockney accent there, everyone's going to laugh at it, regardless of whether there's any joke to it or not.
But Monty Python, I feel like, is just very silly, and that's a good thing. It's a certain kind of comedy that it relies a little more on kind of the slapstick and just the quirky nature of stuff instead of getting into, like, really
traditional comedy. Yeah. And sometimes you need that, especially in an election year. It's nice to have something that's kind of a lighthearted laugh. But I liked it. I thought, it was also interesting to see a lot of stuff we always talk about going back to source material. In this movie, there are a lot of references in pop culture in really everywhere to it. So
it was cool
you love SpongeBob. You love referencing SpongeBob. And this is very similar to SpongeBob's humor, the surreal nature of everything.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think I noticed any literal parallels from SpongeBob with this one, but the style of comedy absolutely very similar. And yeah, I like that. It's fun. We'll get into it once we get into some of the scenes and what I liked about it. But you have talked about this movie time and time again. What is kind of your take on the movie?
What I think it ultimately is it's a satire of things that we were all raised on in some way. So I was not raised really with the Arthurian legends in their original form, but we all loved Sword in the Stone with Disney, and you basically carried the legend of Arthur around with you, and Excalibur and pulling the sword from the stone and so many other details like that. And for this group of people to just come in here and not just throw you a curveball, but like a knuckleball, where you're just like, wait, what's going on here? You don't see any of these jokes coming, and they're all so brilliant. It's so far-fetched. It's beyond outside the box. It's beyond another dimension, in my personal opinion.
I've been to medieval times, a restaurant, and Renaissance fairs, and it's amazing the kind of culmination of just random stuff they put together and slap the name Middle Ages on it. We're talking about a span of hundreds of years, and a lot of the mythology is wrong. So instead of running with some of that, they just or not running with it, they leaned right into it in this movie.
Yeah. And I absolutely loved everything Monty Python when I was 13. There are still plenty of songs that I can sing off the top of my head right now. If you got the melody going, like Always Look on the Bright Side of Life and Every Sperm is Sacred, which was very ironic because I originally thought, so I was 13 when I heard this, I thought that Every Sperm was Sacred was a pro-Catholic song.
Yeah, so let's get into Monty Python and, talk a little bit about kind of who they are.
Okay, so Monty Python was a British comedy troupe. They had this sketch comedy show on BBC One that aired from 1969 to 1974, and this was also would make its way onto PBS in the United States. So my dad and another one of my uncles talked about watching it while they were growing up and how it was able to reach them. And they had a total of 45 episodes. Their cast, and some of our audience may recognize some of these guys, included 6 guys: John Cleese, Michael Palin, Graham Chapman, Terry Jones, Eric Idle, and Terry Gilliam. So, any of them familiar to you, Koda?
Yeah, I mean, John Cleese is a huge name. You see him pop up. I mean, they've done screenings, actually. We talk about Coolidge Corner Theater a lot. He's done, I don't know that he's been there, but other theaters around the area, his own projects, he's come locally to talk, and he's referenced also a lot in kind of inside jokes with comedy writers and everything. I'm definitely the most familiar with him.
Yeah. There's also Terry Gilliam, who's an incredibly accomplished filmmaker as well out there. So anybody who likes Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas or Brazil,
yes.
Yeah, so he's another one of those surreal filmmakers. I don't know if he's more of a comedian with those movies, but he's definitely a surrealist.
Yeah.
And some people might not recognize all the jokes, but there were plenty of famous sketches, such as the Dead Parrot sketch. Have you ever heard of that one?
I forget it, but I believe I've seen it.
That's the one where the guy goes back to a pet store with a bird cage, and he tells the pet store owner, I bought a parrot from you an hour ago, and when I got home, I found out it was dead. And the shop owner is like, no, he's not dead. He's resting. And it's this whole back and forth. It's like, I know a dead parrot when I see one, and I'm looking at one right now.
Yeah. One that I like that they've done is it's like the guy goes into this store, and there's the hearing aid salesman, and then there's the glasses salesman, but the glasses salesman is deaf and the hearing aid salesman's blind or something, and it's just this whole nobody can communicate because people don't have the it's silly, but it's clever.
Yeah, that's the thing about it. When I was younger, my mom, she's never been a fan of like literal silly humor like that because she doesn't think it's very clever. But when I look at guys like Monty Python, I'm like, this is beyond clever. This is like groundbreaking. It's so ridiculous, but it is brilliant.
Yeah, so let's get into this movie specifically.
All right, so this one was released on April 3rd, 1975. The budget, so we're going to be talking about Great Britain pounds or whatever the term is from an economic perspective.
Okay.
This was shot on a budget of 282,035 pounds. Not too bad for a budget, though. I mean, especially for the time.
Yeah. Adjusted for inflation, seems 2.5 million. That's not a ton to shoot a big movie on. And I didn't know this, but you mentioned that the funding came from an interesting place.
Yeah, so there were about 8 investors total, I believe, but 2 big ones that I could recognize were Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, because the studios wouldn't fund it.
That's crazy. I love how, like, sometimes these different bands end up financing these projects that you'd never even think. It's not just film. I mean, the Beatles had financed the development of the CT machine, like for CAT scans, and there's these different like bands British bands. I don't know. I guess that's how they're
more philanthropic. They're more ambitious with their investments.
Yeah, and as you said, a good tax write-off.
Yes, that's true. They considered it a tax write-off. So that was their other incentive to do it. So it just seems like, okay, I might want to get my financial advice from the Rolling Stones now. Yeah. Yeah. And their box office was 358,229 pounds. And adjusted for inflation today, that is 21,723,360 pounds.
Yeah, still not quite the same return on investment as some of the movies we recently discussed, but that's pretty darn good.
It's been re-released many times, and it's grossed over $5.5 million. And I even went to a re-release screening at one point.
Cool. Where was that?
That was at the AMC Lowe's by Boston Common. And believe it or not, it had subtitles in there to show you how much of a cult following it is. And there were people reciting the lines as we watched it.
Oh, wow. That sounds fun. Like Jaws.
It is, yeah. So, like I said, movies got to be occasions.
Yeah. So let's get into the plot here. We'll start out with the titles, not subtitles. The movie starts out with this long sequence of still titles that would have been, done by hand, and then they just point a camera at it and record it. It was done.
The titles are written in English, and Michael Palin put these Swedish translations at the bottom, really to entertain the captive audience, as he said. But as the titles progress, it becomes more and more ridiculous. It's no longer translating the credits that are on the screen. It suddenly becomes an advertisement for taking a vacation to Sweden, where you will meet many moose, and the translator says, "A moose bit my sister once." This is all written, by the way, as the titles are going further and further.
And then it gets into, like, crew credits. It says, like, lighting cameraman, and it's like, and then they start, like, interrupting the titles, being like, okay, we got to get this back on track.
We have sacked the original translator. And then the subtitle comes up again and says, "Mind you, moose bites can be pretty nasty." And it's like the person who was responsible for sacking that guy has been sacked.
Yeah, and then they get back into it, and then they did an interesting choice that I don't think you could have done today, is they have this decently long red and yellow strobing background, which,
but
I mean,
here's
they tried
the thing,
that.
they're not talking about the moose in there anymore. They're talking about llamas.
Yeah, and this strobing effect, I mean, not recently, but when Pokemon first came out, they had in Japan an episode with Porygon, and they did this red and blue strobing thing, and a bunch of kids got seizures, and they pulled the episode because you need a warning nowadays, or you need to not put it in. But yeah, that was interesting to see that that's stuck even in the version on Amazon Prime that I watched.
When you play video games, when I still turn on my PlayStation 4, it says, health and safety warnings about strobe lights and seizures. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's definitely a different era now where we're approaching this. But it for those of us who are not epileptic, we got a kick out of it.
Yeah, and then we start getting into the actual movie after this fun little title intro.
Yeah. So it starts off where King Arthur is riding through England in search of knights to join his round table at Camelot. And I love the introduction over there because it sounds like he's coming by riding on a horse. But once he finally gets into the shot, what do we see, Koda?
He is followed by a page or some sort of assistant, and he is clacking together some coconut shells.
Yes, while Arthur is pretending that he's riding on horseback. And
yeah, and that's another thing that you see, because yeah, they would use that in the Foley department to do horse steps, but then you just lean into it and put it on screen, and the whole movie they're riding around on these non-existent horses, and the one guy's job is just to follow around with the coconuts.
oh yeah, I love it. Later point in the movie, that they're all making the pages are making these weird kind of horse sounds, and everyone's pretending to be riding, and they say, "They're nervous, sire." It's like, well, we better leave them here and carry out on foot. Dismount.
They like pantomime getting off a horse, and then they just leave these pages.
Yeah, and the first castle they get to, they're not so much interested in King Arthur trying to recruit for his round table, but they're more concerned about, where did you get the coconuts? And he has this whole, well, maybe a swallow brought it while it was migrating. And that they get into the whole debate, these two guards amongst each other. It's like, well, what if it was a European swallow? It's like, yeah, but what if an African swallow did this? And, Arthur finds out that this is important knowledge to hold on to. So we'll get back to that later.
Yeah, so then he continues along on his journey and runs into a interesting character played by John Cleese, the Black Knight.
And the Black Knight is guarding a bridge. Arthur wants to cross it. He refuses to let him cross it. They get in an all-out sword fight, and King Arthur hacks off the knight's arm. However, the knight's like, "'Tis but a scratch," and just continues to fight.
"'Tis but a flesh wound."
Yeah, he hacks off the other arm, and so the knight now is just kicking him, and, Arthur's like, "Look, you stupid bastard, you got no arms left!" And eventually hacks off all of his legs and leaves him there as just a human torso who still thinks he can fight him. If only Anakin Skywalker had done that on Mustafar.
Imagine. They keep moving along, and they get into this town, where in the town there is a start of a witch trial going on, and they have this young woman who's brought before some head of the town, a knight or somebody, who basically they say, well, she's a witch, and he's like, well, why do you say she's a witch? So then they conduct a little impromptu witch trial.
Yes, and so this is run by Sir Bedivere, and what I love about this scene is that it sounds ridiculous, but this is how a lot of witch trials did happen in the Middle Ages, where the ultimate logic, what do you do with witches? We burn them. What do you burn apart from witches? Instead of saying more witches, one of them says wood and says, why do witches burn? And they're like, because they're made of wood? And he says, yes. And how do we tell if she's made of wood? Build a bridge out of her. Ah, but can you not also make bridges out of stone? And they say, what happens when you put it in water? It floats. And he says, well, what also floats in water? And they're going off this whole litany of guesses like bread, apples, very small rocks, cider, gravy. And Arthur, riding by, says, a duck. And the final piece of logic they're using is, if she weighs the same as a duck, she's made of wood, and therefore a witch.
Yeah, you called it logic. It is fallacious logic. It's a trial. They then put this woman on a scale and a duck on the other side. She clearly weighs more than the duck.
It's a fair crop. She's like, fair point.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I recently saw Wired did one of those test, support things with an expert on, and it was witch support, and Mickey Bronk, I think is her name, and she said she loved this scene because that it is the kind of trials they actually would do and come to the conclusion, oh, a witch.
Yeah.
So after this little trial, we see this fun little scene. Kevin, tell us about Camelot.
As they're on their way to Camelot, to their new home, he has just recruited Sir Bedivere, by the way, and he has been joined by Sir Lancelot, Sir Galahad, Sir Robin, and the next scene you see is this whole song and dance number about how they love their life in Camelot. But at the very last minute, they suddenly cut back to that shot of them arriving at Camelot, and Arthur says, no, let us not go there. It is a silly place.
And it was interesting, that scene. You said you haven't played much RuneScape. I played RuneScape. Sometimes I still even log on now. But there's, in one of the towns in RuneScape, there's a party room, which is like a little castle, and they have these singing and dancing knights that appear sometimes, and it's clearly a reference to this film.
Instead of going to Camelot, they just continue to ride, and they are suddenly God speaks to them, and God's really not the type of God that we've come to know over the years. This is a God who's just like, stop groveling and don't apologize, and just like those miserable psalms. They're so depressing, and gives them a new task. You need to find the Holy Grail. to inspire hope in this period of dark time.
Yeah, and this is the second podcast episode we've talked about a finding of the Holy Grail.
Yeah, we did the Indiana Jones saga a few months ago, and basically what we talked about in that one, I'm sure everybody knows the legend of the Holy Grail. So first off, I have to make this little disclaimer. There is no basis for it in any history of religious devotion. It's allegedly the chalice that Christ used at the Last Supper, and anybody who drinks of it becomes immortal. They can never die. And it's very interesting because this is really just a product of medieval folklore. You don't see it among any of the early Christian intellectuals talking about it. Nobody gives a damn about it.
Yeah, it's kind of people writing their fan fiction for the Bible.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I really want to get into that. I mean, some fan fiction might be a little frightening.
Well, no, not that kind. No, I'm saying that the Holy Grail was, in a sense, the fan fiction.
It is our MacGuffin for this one, so we have to accept it.
As they get on with their new mission, they approach this castle, which is manned by this French. It's the stereotypical
Frenchman insulting everybody and saying, "I fart in your general direction." And what I love the most about it is they say, "Can we come inside?" And they say, "Of course not. You are English types." And they're like, "Well, what are you?" It's like, "I'm French. Can't you tell by my accent?"
And then that unravels, and they start launching pretty much anything and everything from the castle out at the English, and they got to figure out a way to try to get in.
Yeah, well, my favorite detail about that is that they're throwing out all these animals, and the historic background behind that, this little Easter egg, was that as long as a castle or a place was under siege, it was all about draining their supplies. And as a way to symbolize that they had given up and they were giving into the demands of the siege, they would throw the last of their food over. So this is the French saying to them, "Hey, we can outlast you guys. You don't scare us."
Yeah.
They decide to make the equivalent of a Trojan horse in a Trojan rabbit, which is very interesting because as Bedivere details his plan, which is Lancelot, Galahad, and I wait until nightfall, and then we get out and take the French by surprise. And Arthur says, "Who leaps out?" It's like, Lancelot, Galahad, and I. And they're like, "Oh, no." Yeah, and I love the way they finish that scene. It's just the French throw the rabbit back at them.
Yeah. So they had enough with these annoying French guys, and
they decide to split and go their separate ways, seeing if some of them could get there quicker than others. And what do Arthur and Bedivere end up doing, Koda?
They stumble upon these knights in the forest. The knights say, "We are the knights who say knee," and they are, oh my gosh, not the knights that say knee. It's just like,
there's something about saying the word knee that cripples and wounds people. And so they're able to wield that to their advantage, and they want something in return. What do they want, Koda?
They want a shrubbery.
Yes. And so they go out and they eventually get the shrubbery, but they also tell them, "We want another shrubbery, and you have to then cut down the mightiest tree in the forest with a herring." And exactly as that moment happens, they reconnect with Sir Robin, and they begin to converse with each other. However, they're ironically saying the one word the knights who say knee cannot bear to hear. Which one is that?
It.
Yes. So Arthur and Robin are freely going, "No, I have not found it. It is far from this forest. I was looking for it." And they're
Stop
just
saying
overwhelmed.
that.
Yeah, and so they just decide to ride off. And so speaking of Robin, let's at least go to where he was.
So he's also trying to find his way through the forest, and he runs into this three-headed knight.
which is really just three brothers arguing amongst themselves and bickering about what it's like living with each other.
Yeah, and it's the classic, one wants this, one wants the other. The middle one can't deal with the two of them, and then the middle one, it's just constant. And then they realize, oh, we could just walk past them because they're just fighting with each other.
Yeah. And after that, there's Galahad and the Castle Anthrax. So Galahad was known as the chaste and the pure, and he goes to a castle, which is basically like the setting for a porno, where all these, beautiful young women are just freely being sexual with each other.
And they're like, whoa, well, we need a strong man over here, and just seducing him, and he is not comfortable.
Well, he eventually gives in because they're like, well, we have to punish the person, because he wandered into the castle because he saw what looked like the Holy Grail, an image of the Holy Grail hovering above it, but it was a grail-shaped beacon. And they say, well, we have to punish the sister who did this. You have to tie her on a bed and spank her. And all the other women are like, a spanking! And that's like,
you have to punish us too.
And yeah, he's like, well, I suppose I could stick around a little while longer. And then Lancelot arrives and rescues him, even though he's trying to argue. He's like, oh, I could stay and fight them. There's only 150 of them. Then here's my favorite little subplot over there. Sir Lancelot is riding through the forest, and he gets a message from someone who appears to be a princess being forced to marry against her will. And he breaks into the castle and this bloody over the top, everyone's just peacefully going about their ways, and he's slaughtering everybody that he sees trying to get there.
These are the wedding guests that
yes.
are there for this wedding, and this maniac comes running in with a sword, slicing the guests left and right.
Yeah, and then he finally gets to the bedroom in the tallest tower, and he finds out, oh, it's not a princess, it's just an effeminate prince. And then Arthur and the knights eventually regroup, and they're guided by a fella named Tim the Enchanter, who's a guy who's like a hybrid between a human and a goat sort of thing, and he's bringing them to this place called the Cave of Caer Banog. And what's at the Cave of Caer Banog, Koda?
There is this fierce monster that just completely devours everything and anything that comes near the cave, and the monster we see is a little white bunny.
Yes, it's a little white bunny, and they're just like, whatever. They send their knight Sir Bors over, and the rabbit proceeds to bite its head off. And
it's just it goes from a real rabbit in one shot to then this demonic puppet that has blood tubing and stuff, and it's spraying everywhere. It's this and it launches itself at it is just this.
And then they decide, okay, well, let's just overwhelm the rabbit and attack it, but the rabbit's taking everybody out, and they have to flee, and they decide to use a holy relic that they carry with them, the holy hand grenade of Antioch.
It's literally a rock with a piece of metal strapping around it, and it looks
it's got a little golden cross on it.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like some sort of artifact or something, but it's clearly not a grenade. But, well, we find out that it very much is.
And they blow the rabbit to Kingdom Come, and they enter the cave, and they find on the walls an inscription carved by Joseph of Arimathea, who was one of the Pharisees and a friend of Jesus, who tradition and medieval folklore said he was the keeper of the Grail, and he carves on the wall, it's at the castle over there, and they're having a whole debate about what did he die as he was carving it? And they're like, well, if he would have died,
you wouldn't carve that. Well, maybe he was transcribing it.
Maybe he was dictating. It's he just would have died. He wouldn't have bothered to write his last. Yeah, but this is broken up because they are eventually confronted by the big black beast of whatever. And it eats the monk that was transcribing everything, and they're running through, they're being chased in this little animated manner. And all the animation is being done by Terry Gilliam, by the way.
Yeah, this is a fun type of animation. It's cut paper, so it's instead of every frame is drawn, it's basically you'd draw it, cut it out, and then you'd move that around as a stop motion, and it's very well done. It's fun. It's this little kind of Scooby-Doo chase kind of thing in this castle running away from this monster.
Yes. However, they're able to get away. Why, Koda?
Well, because that the animator has a heart attack.
Yes. So the quest can continue. The next scene, they reach the Bridge of Death, guarded by the old man from scene 24, somebody they saw earlier in the movie. There are 3 questions that he's going to ask, and you have to get the answers to the questions right. If you get it right, you can cross in safety, but if you get it wrong, you're cast into the Gorge of Eternal Peril. They first send Sir Robin, but Sir Robin says, I have a great idea. Why doesn't Lancelot go? And Lancelot enthusiastically goes. And
they start asking the questions. And what are those questions, Kevin?
The first question, what is your name? And he says, my name is Sir Lancelot of Camelot. And he says, what is your quest? And he says, to seek the Holy Grail. And then he says, what? With a pause and says, is your favorite color? He says, blue. So, right, off you go. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Robin's enthusiastically running to the front. I'm going to answer these questions, and says, what's your name? Sir Robin of Camelot. What is your quest? To seek the Holy Grail. And then he says, what is the capital of Assyria? And he doesn't know it. And so he gets thrown off into the gorge. Galahad, he gets the first 2 questions right. My name is Sir Galahad. I seek the Grail. And then he asks him the easy one. What is your favorite color? And then he second guesses his favorite color, so he's thrown into the gorge.
I love that. With the jokes, it keeps building and evolving, and they run it with as far with it as they can.
The ultimate payoff comes when Arthur gets to the bridge, and he asks him, what is your name? Arthur, King of the Britons. What is your quest? To seek the Grail. And the question he asks, and everybody had to be paying attention to this, is, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
Back to the swallows and the coconuts.
Yes, and he just simply retorts with, what do you mean? An African or European swallow? Which is a variable that the old man had never considered, and so he's thrown off into the gorge.
Yeah, again, running the joke right into the end zone. I love it.
They cross the Bridge of Death, but there's a 10-second intermission. In case we all forgot, we have to have an intermission.
Yeah, so again, movies used to have intermissions. This is playing off of both kind of the comedy of meta film jokes, and you'd normally expect, I mean, theater too, it was the same thing, but it would be a title card that went on the screen. In movie theaters, it said intermission, and it would be up there.
It's so out of place because the type of image that it is, and the font and the music, it's kind of like this electronic organs playing everything. And it's like a 10-second intermission out of nowhere, and then it just it just continues.
Yeah, the movie has a couple minutes left, and they throw that in there, which is fun.
And they eventually make it to the castle that was inscribed in the cave. However, it's been occupied by the French, the same taunters that we saw earlier in the movie. And Arthur's like, all right, we're going to rally all of our troops together. We're going to take this castle. And as they're ready to storm it, what happens, Koda?
Well, this, you need a little more background to understand, because we haven't talked about it thus far, but some
but what happens
modern-day police officers show up and start throwing people in the paddy wagon.
Yeah, it's just these few cops over there. They're telling everyone, they got their megaphones, they're telling everybody, go home, go home. They find Arthur, and a woman points to them saying, that's them, officers, that's them. And it turns out, throughout this movie, we had a historian who was informing us about what was happening with Arthur and his knights. However, somebody on a horse comes riding by. So that's the one horse that actually made it into the movie, I believe. Somebody took the one horse they had just to kill the historian, and the contemporary authorities are trying to conduct an investigation. And so now it's finally paid off. And they're saying, yeah, those are the guys. And they just casually book them like they're going to prison.
Yeah, and they would throw in throughout the movie between different scenes. They would have kind of you'd see the detectives doing their investigation, and it's
like
it's fun.
Taking pictures of the body and just analyzing the scene. They go to one of the cameramen. He puts his hand in the camera. And he's like, "Shut that off, Sonny," and it just plays that intermission theme.
Yeah, and this is where we're going to get into a little bit about the reception of the movie, because I mean, it goes without saying that ending is going to be controversial.
Well, they opted for it ultimately because it was cheaper, because like they didn't have that much left in their budget, but they realized that's what made it funnier. Was just that they gave it a ridiculous ending. I love what they're playing with, is that whole MacGuffin, that you're trying to get this one thing that's driving the whole plot, and there's like, no, you're not going to get it, and it's going to be in a totally unfulfilled manner.
The critics had mixed thoughts about this movie.
They did, yeah. So it wasn't the cult classic that it is today. Some movies are hits right away. I guess this was a bit of a sleeper, and you probably get it more in the late night airings, basically over here in the United States with PBS, like I said earlier. But it has become a cult classic, and it's, believe it or not, this movie is considered to be a postmodern film. So are we going to try to wade into that that area today?
Okay,
what is postmodernism?
For some background to the viewer, Kevin texts me and says, "Oh, this movie's considered a postmodern thing. How much do you know about postmodernism?" I'm like, "Oh God, I pulled up some of the notes that I've referenced. I think it was the one we did for Christmas.
Die Hard.
Die Hard. Thank you. And we talked about semiotics there, but I pulled up the same class notes, and it basically, I sent you a copy of the notes I took. Were they legible?
I mean,
notes.
They were typed. They were still typed, so they were legible compared to the handwriting of either of us.
But in terms of spelling,
was it intelligible? God. Was it intelligible? Could I learn anything from it? And to be honest with you, I didn't even read it. I just went to the Wikipedia summary, and I was just like, look, if Wikipedia says it, then I'm willing to accept whatever this is.
The worst part is I did the same thing. They were my notes.
Well, what was your final grade in that class?
I think it was... I did okay because it probably got a B in the class. But anyway, postmodernism, quick recap, Kevin.
It's a method to make you question your frame of reference. Like you think about placing bits of irony in there or juxtaposition, things that like really shouldn't be there. So it's this... They gave the reference of mixing high humor with low humor, like mixing fart jokes with witty, clever comebacks and everything that we were talking about earlier. And this is also something that coincided with the rise of feminism and multiculturalism and post-colonialism. So it was really a way to repudiate this homogenous approach to looking at life. When you look at the vastness, the depth of everything, and the shading, and the exact fine tuning of things.
We're starting to get into game theory here, and there's so many moving parts when you try to start talking about these different things. But yeah, basically, yes, it's a kind of semi-meta way of going about trying to tell the story.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Monty Python and the Holy Grail would end up in this category, this very thought-provoking movie in the end, where they're joking, "I fart in your general direction." And other postmodern films that you can look at is Psycho. That was our very first film, and I think the way they did it there is you have the introduction of Marion Crane, and you think this movie's going to be following her, but she gets killed halfway into the movie, and it goes in a totally different direction. So in addition to Psycho, we have movies like Once Upon a Time in the West, Star Wars, then you have Blade Runner, and Pulp Fiction, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and believe it or not, Deadpool.
That is nuts that this movie is in that same category. But yeah, it has the elements. If it looks like a duck and acts like a duck, call it a duck.
Well, except in this sort of it wouldn't be a duck. It would be some kind of grenade. We talk about it in the movie where this is all done really via breaking the fourth wall. And so the examples that we have through that are this whole notion of the animator dying advances the plot. dingo of Castle Anthrax, in which she goes into an aside. She literally breaks the fourth wall and says, "Do you think this scene should have been cut? We were so worried when the boys were writing it." And everybody else, all the other characters are like, "Get on with it, get on with it." So overall, Koda, what did you think of this movie? Would you recommend it to anybody?
Absolutely. I think that go into it just to enjoy it. Don't try to go in with trying to analyze it right off the bat. Go back and rewatch it and maybe apply some of those lenses to it. But just, it's fun. It's something you can watch and just laugh at. And I think the diversity of the humor, there's a lot of that silly humor, as we mentioned, but you also pointed out your mom's not usually a big fan of that, but there's stuff in here that she can enjoy. And there is also kind of high classical humor stuff, and you get a little everything, and I liked it. I think it was also, I always love seeing some of those source material for the jokes that you see in everyday life, and my dad references the killer bunny.
Yeah, it's the whole point, is you may not have seen the movie, but you know the source material.
And what are your final thoughts?
It's clever humor in the end, because like I said, it's humor that you don't expect to see. It takes you in a totally different direction every time. And it's just not just the fact that the accents in itself. I think most of the humor comes just from the fact of the accents, because I don't know if you could really pull it off with American accents or, God forbid, a German accent.
Oh, God.
But it's always worth watching. And so I look forward to the day when I'm able to introduce somebody to this movie. I tried to introduce it to so many people I knew growing up, but they wouldn't laugh at it. And it was just myself, my brothers, and a few other friends who were able to appreciate the humor.
I would recommend watching it alone so you don't feel bad about laughing at some of the things. Because, like, The Knights of Satan, I loved that so much. It was so silly. But I could see, if there's a whole, several people there, you might not be laughing at that because it's silly, and just be able to enjoy it. Kind of remove that constraint.
Yeah. All right, so this was my movie for this episode. So, Koda, you are at the helm for the next episode, and what will we be discussing?
So we teased this last week, and we're gonna do it. Devil Wears Prada.
So this was my first time watching it.
Oh yeah, and you had some interesting thoughts. I have some interesting thoughts. It's a good movie. So
yeah,
we're gonna get into that next week. A little more serious, not entirely comedy, but it still has quite a lot of comedy in it.
Yeah, still very good. All right.
Well, I'm Cody Ewell.
And I'm Kevin Gainey. Join us next time on Moviehouse Mystics.